Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The Correctional Association softens the path of the too many imprisoned in the state. They use a conspiracy of hard work and patience to do it. Robert Gangi, the executive director, an old friend of mine, is here to tell us how it works. So
hey,
welcome.
Ronnie. Thank you.
So tell us about the Correctional Association. Has a great, I like the history. It's unique, right?
It's an extraordinary history. We were founded in 1844, so 164 years ago. In 1846, the state legislature passed a law that established us as a legal nonprofit entity, and a provision of the law gives us the authority to visit prisons. And so it's very unique. We're the only private organization in New York State that has that kind of authority. There's only one of two organizations in the country that has that authority. So we can go into the prisons wherever we want to go, talk to whoever we want to talk to. So we talk to prisoners, staff, superintendents, issue reports, and lobby and advocate for improvements.
Do you have to make the appointments ahead of time, or can you just show up?
We probably legally, technically could just show up, but we do make the appointments ahead of time, and we do attempt and are largely successful in working collaboratively with prison officials. If we just showed up at the gate, first of all, they probably wouldn't let us in, you know, even if we could say legally you had to. So we work it through that way, but we feel we get a real picture of what goes on in the facilities because we can speak to the prisoners at length, privately, confidentially, and all over the prison.
I mean, I used to do a lot of work with Bedford Hills and some of the prisons, and when I worked for Governor Cuomo, and I remember I was invited to Greenhaven by a group of prisoners, and it was well arranged and approved, and I was working in the governor's office, you know. I get to Greenhaven, and the public relations guy's outside, and he says, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Eldridge, you can't come in." I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "You can't come. You're married to Jimmy Breslin, aren't you?" But I got in. But it's not an easy thing to get in.
No. Very few people have access. I mean, legislators have access, judges have access, but usually even when they go into prison, it's a
planned thing.
Planned, exactly. It's programmed, and they get brought around to different parts of the prison by the superintendent and his or her staff. We meet with the superintendent and his or her executive team, but we spend a lot of time on our own with prisoners and with staff. So we feel in a day or two at a facility, we get a good picture of what goes on in a prison.
I think a lot of people ask, why do we care about people who are in prison?
And I think there are a number of reasons. One is we have a moral obligation. I mean, we have decided as a society and a government to deprive people of their liberty and send them to prison. Then we have, for better or worse, the responsibility to care for those people, to provide for some level of activity, provide some preparation for them when they get out, to provide for medical services they need it, to provide decent housing. Not luxury accommodations, but decent housing. Plus, from the standpoint of our enlightened self-interest, we want people to come out prepared for release, prepared for society, because virtually everybody locked up in New York, across the country, is sooner or later going to come back to the community. If they come back embittered, if they come back with little or no skills to make a proper adjustment, they will present continuing problems for their communities.
And actually, the recidivism rate is so great that greater percentage of most of the people in prisons are recidivists.
In New York State, the recidivist rate is 50%, but how it's measured is 50% of the prisoners released return to New York State prison within 5 years. So we don't know what that means about the other 50% in terms of the kind of adjustments they've made.
Jeremy Travers wrote a very good book. I don't know if you've read it, but They All Come Back.
Yes,
it's about that.
Exactly.
And it's a whole, it seemed to me that the old philosophy that we've had about people in prison is changing again. It went from helping them when they come out to not doing anything, and now to realizing,
Well, there's a lot of emphasis on what's called reentry or reintegration, because there's been an explosion in the use of prisons over the last 35 years. So, for example, in 1973, there were about 300,000 people locked up in the United States. Now,
it's millions.
2.3 million. So a growth of over 600% in 3.5 decades. It's the largest expansion in the use of prisons in our history and in the history of the world. It's extraordinary.
We're the highest. We have the highest rate of incarceration?
We have the largest number.
In the world?
In the world. 25% of the people locked up in the world are confined in the United States prisons or jail. 25%. And we only have 5% of the world's population. So Jeremy Travers, who's the president at John Jay College, and many other people are focusing on the reentry issue, because we've locked so many people up, hundreds of thousands of people, I think it's almost 700,000 people a year, return from prison to the community. So there's a growing awareness that it's a responsibility on the part of communities and the government to help those people, or else they'll continue to be troubled, get in trouble, and
But they're
cause
not
trouble.
isolated individuals. I mean, we have to remember, when I worked for Cuomo, I think there were like 600 women incarcerated, and now they're
Almost 3,000.
3,000.
Yeah.
And those women, something like 80% of them have children.
Yes. It's about 75% of the women locked up in New York State prisons are mothers.
Yeah.
So, and one of the points we make, particularly about the confinement of women, but also it's true about the confinement of so many men, it's how disruptive it is to the family and the community. There's more attention. Barack Obama gave a speech a couple of weeks ago about the absentee fathers, particularly in the black community. And one of the reasons is this extraordinary burst in the use of incarceration, because there's such a disproportionate confinement of African American men. The numbers are extraordinary. In New York State, over 50% of the people locked up in New York State prisons are African American men, and even though they make up a much smaller percentage of the overall population.
And a great percentage of the people, especially the women, I think, are there for drug-related,
nonviolent drug-related
offenses.
Right, absolutely.
And that's
true.
become one of your, I mean, the Correctional Association, in addition to visiting prisons and issuing reports and trying to improve conditions, you have other projects, public policy.
Well, I want to make
projects.
one other point about reentry, and then I'm happy to talk about some of our other projects. Our point is there should be, the emphasis on reentry is important, but there should be a greater emphasis on what we call pre-entry. A greater emphasis on what happens to people before they get caught up in the criminal justice system, so that there's more effort at providing for resources for community-based prevention programs to help people deal with the problems that get them into trouble, to help people deal with addiction, healthcare-related problems, the fact that they don't have employable skills, domestic violence problems, which are the kind of things that one way or another feed into the state prison system.
And mental health.
Right, and mental health. Mental health is a critical one. And the research shows that the people who are diverted from prison have a much better track record in being able to make a successful readjustment to society. People who didn't go into prison but went into an alternative to incarceration type program. So the line we've used, the soundbite we've come up with, is the best reentry program is to not lock people up in the first place. That's better for the people who are engaged in these programs. It's much less expensive to society, and it also works better for the large society.
Is that appropriate, you think, for the nonviolent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what percentage of offenses are?
Each year, over 50% of the people who go to state prison go to prison for nonviolent offenses.
And people go to state prison if they're serving a sentence of a year or longer.
In New York State.
Yeah.
If you're convicted of a felony that calls for a year or more prison sentence, you go to state prison.
But even some of the violent offenses are one-time violence.
Yes. Yes. Right. Our view is, what you were referencing before is our work on other issues. The key issue that we work on is promoting the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws. The Rockefeller drug laws were enacted in 1973. They were the harshest mandatory sentencing laws then in the country, applied to low-level nonviolent drug offenders. And in 1973, again, we had about 300,000 people locked up in the United States. As I said before, now we have 2.3 million. So the Rockefeller drug laws were the granddaddy of these kind of harsh sentencing laws.
Just
that
put them
led
away, get them out of society, put them away.
For long periods of time. Eventually, every state in the country passed laws along those lines. So the Rockefeller drug law started the trend, the movement toward the greater use of imprisonment. And we are now aggressively promoting the repeal of the Rockefeller drug laws, return sentencing discretion to judges so judges can make individualized assessments of each case before them and divert more people from prison.
Now they're locked into what sentences they have to
Right,
make.
because that's what mandatory sentencing means.
Now, there was some legislative movement on that issue, but it's not enough.
It was very modest. The most significant aspect of it is there was a retroactivity provision that apply to some of the people in prison who were serving the longest period of time under the Rockefeller drug laws. So about 200 people got relief. So 200 people were able to reapply to the courts for reduction in their sentence. They received a reduction in their sentence. They were returned to the community. But there were over 13,000 drug offenders in state prison, and each year we send over 6,000 people to prison for drug offenses.
And what's the amount of drugs that you're found with?
Well, it's a small amount of drugs can trigger a very harsh punishment. After the changes in 2004, if you're convicted of selling 2 ounces or possessing 8 ounces, now that's not a lot of drugs. That doesn't mean you're a kingpin by any stretch of the imagination. The judge has to sentence you to prison for a term of between 8 to 20 years. So it's called flat sentencing. So the judge picks a sentence between 8 to 20, and that's how much time you do. So you can do 15, 16, 17 years for which by any definition a minor offense and not a violent offense. And again, because the laws are mandatory, and because guilt is based not on your role in the transaction, but on the amount of drugs in your possession when you're arrested, the laws tend to catch in their net the
low-level drug?
The low-level people, what we call the hole-in-the-pants brigade.
So the people that are selling to the Wall Street people.
Right.
Or the people, yeah.
Right. Well, the people who are the major profiteers are savvy enough about the law and about how drug offenses are prosecuted, never to touch drugs. The main criterion for guilt is the amount of drugs in your possession when you're arrested. The way you avoid the sanctions of the law is never to touch drugs. And particularly in poor communities of color, there are plenty of people with fewer little skills who can't get a decent paying job, who are willing to engage in the drug trade.
That kind of thing?
Right.
And then the percentage of them are people of color.
It's extraordinary. And the research shows that the majority of people who use and sell drugs are white. 90% of the people locked up in New York State prisons for the sale or possession of a narcotic are people of color.
90% people who use and buy.
Well, no,
is that what you said?
90% of the people locked up for a drug offense in New York are people of color.
Right.
Even though the research shows that the majority of people who use and even sell drugs are white, because law enforcement focuses the so-called war on drugs. Street level, right, on inner city communities of color, because middle-class people of any color use drugs or trade in drugs behind closed walls. Their offices, their homes, much harder to apprehend and prosecute those people. In the inner city, low-income communities, the drug trade's out in the street or in the hallways of tenement buildings. So the drug sweeps and the buy and bust produce large numbers of people that you can then prosecute for a drug felony. And it's become this huge, almost monster, this huge machinery. If you go into the city courts and you go to the arraignment court where people are charged, it's person after person of people of color, one after another, charged with low-level drug offenses, people who are not particularly dangerous or predatory, who might be public nuisances, but could get help through other kinds of responses. And because of mandatory sentencing, like the Rockefeller drug laws, the courts have to send them to prison.
And the women usually, the percentage of women that are in prison for drugs
is higher than the percentage of men. I mean, there are the rough figures. There are about 2,500 to 3,000 women locked up in New York State prison, and about 59,000 to 60,000 men locked up in New York State prison. So the number of women is much smaller, but the percentage of women locked up for drug offenses is higher. And it's it's often that they are only involved in the margins of the drug trade. They are participating because of a relationship with, it could be a father, it could be an uncle, it could be a mate, and they sometimes take the fall, and the men get a lesser punishment.
Yeah, that's always been the standard thing.
Right, because the women know less how to negotiate a deal for themselves.
So they say, anyway, it's a terrible thing. You have other projects too. One is Juvenile Justice, which is an interesting thing in your pre-preventive program, right? Because I think the kids that we get into that system are very vulnerable kids.
Right, and often, in effect, if a young person in New York gets locked up or detained in a juvenile jail, you're putting them on the road to eventually ending up in an adult prison. And our Juvenile Justice Project has produced some very impressive statistics. For example, in New York City, actually this is the city's own number, but we publicize it, it costs over $215,000 a year to confine a young person. And in New York City's detention facilities, 99 to 100% of the children locked up are children of color. And we're really talking about children because New York State is one of 2 states in the country that when you turn 16, you become an adult. So the children that we have locked up or detained in our juvenile facilities it's for offense they committed when they were 15 or younger. So it is young people, and the majority of them, and I didn't know this until our project did the analysis, the majority of them are not charged with violent or predatory offenses. The majority of them end up locked up, and this is by a wide consensus of opinion, because we have insufficient community-based alternatives for the family courts to send them to. They come from dysfunctional homes, or lousy schools. The judges in the family court don't want to send them back to that situation, end up sending them to a jail or a detention facility because there's insufficient options. Now, the city and state are moving to create more options and more programs, and the Bloomberg administration and the Spitzer administration before Spitzer went down were making taking some progressive steps. So we're encouraged.
In 1971, 69 to 72, when I worked for John Lindsay, that's what we were talking about. And in those days, we had PINS classifications, persons in need of supervision. And then we had juvenile offender. Do we still have PINS?
Yeah.
Are they incarcerated, or are they into foster care?
Much less so.
Yeah.
Much less so.
And that's when we closed. We closed Menida and Zarega. They were two facilities.
Yeah.
And I read the report that a 17-year-old or 18-year-old intern in your organization wrote on Spofford. I could not believe that Spofford was still open.
Right.
It's a facility in Hunts Point.
Yes.
Which at one point they closed and they put everybody on a barge, right? Then there was such a public outcry, they put them back into Spofford.
Well, also the Giuliani administration promised to close it and then reopened it. And one of our main policy goals in the coming year or two is to push for the close of Spofford. The city does not need it.
It's an inhuman environment for anybody to be in, and especially for a young person.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, Spofford is now used, it's better than it used to be. It's used as an intake facility, so the young people are not there that long. And still, it's a very unpleasant place and a gray and gloomy place, and children should not be locked up in it. It's enormously expensive to operate, and we don't need it because the Bloomberg administration is moving to create alternative programs. There's been a reduction in the number of kids locked up.
So we don't have that many. At one point, they had kids, I think, on cots in the dining room.
Right. That's probably true. I mean,
yeah.
Right. And the
school,
we know,
the
and we know
education is minimal, right?
Right.
The Board of Ed is supposed to
there are some education programs inside the facilities, but it's obviously not the best place for children to learn. And the evidence is showing us consistently that well-staffed and well-resourced, I guess that's one and the same thing, community-based alternative programs work much better. They're cheaper, and they're more successful in reducing recidivist rates, and they're more successful in helping the young person and his or her family stabilize their lives. So there's a lot of evidence to support our arguments. We're not just bleeding hearts, although our hearts do bleed for the young people we're talking about. This is very practical right. And so we should do it because it's right, and should do it because it works.
And one of the other programs is the Women's Prison Project.
Yes, right. And
that's been around for
quite
a while.
We've been around since 1991. So yeah, and we focus on the concerns, the needs, the aspirations of women who are confined and their families. We visit. Because of the visiting authority, we go into the women's facilities, we issue reports. One of the prisons we focused on is Bedford Hills, which is in Westchester County, where there have been a number of consistently reported problems. And
is that considered a maximum? Or
that is the one maximum security prison for women in the state. We're also promoting legislation and programs that would enable women who were locked up, who were mothers, incarcerated mothers, to maintain better relationships with their children and with their families. We're supporting legislation that would. A number of the women who were confined in New York State were victims of domestic violence, and the domestic violence in one way or another contributed to their crime. And we're promoting legislation that would enable the state to reduce the sentences of women who fall into that category, so they could be released earlier and begin the journey back to a healthy, stable life.
And abuse also when they're children.
Yes,
it's a great history of that.
Right.
And
about 80 to 90% of the women locked up in New York State have history of being physically or
really
sexually abused. Yes.
And then when they have children, the interaction between the woman who's incarcerated and the foster care system is acute.
Yes.
Because a lot of these women are single parents. And what happens to their children if they don't go to a family representative? They go into foster care, and then what happens when they're in foster care?
The danger in some cases is that they can lose their parental rights. there's legislation on the books that says basically if a mother does not have contact with her child for 15 of 22 months, she's in danger of losing her parental rights, and the foster care agency should take steps to abrogate those rights. And one of the pieces of legislation we're promoting is a bill that would provide an exception to that policy for incarcerated mothers. And we've had success in moving it through the Assembly, and we're still working on the State Senate, and we think sooner or later we'll get that law passed.
I remember that part of it is that they get their notice very late because their addresses have been changed and they're not there.
Right.
And then they have a difficulty with the phones and trying
So
to get somebody.
All of that.
Life is very tough, right?
It's very difficult for them to maintain contact with the foster care homes where the children are, or with the foster care agency workers, and they don't have advocates particularly who are working on their behalf. So it's a real problem, and it's not only creates enormous pain and stress and anguish for the woman who's locked up, but also for the children and the family.
It's terrible.
Right.
And then the question of mental health. I mean, Elaine Lord, who's a former head of Bedford Hills, has said that the percentage of mentally ill women in that facility is so high, and that they never should be in prison to begin with.
Right.
What are you doing?
The state, we have focused on the mental health issue. The state figures are astounding. 8,400 mentally ill people locked up in New York State Prison. That's double the number of people, mentally ill people locked up, not locked up or confined in our, or serviced in our state mental hospitals. So the state prison system has become, for better or worse, a dumping ground for people with mental health problems.
It's a substitute for the institutions you used to have.
Right.
Because we don't have the
community-based services to provide for people. And it's one of the problems with mandatory sentencing laws, because judges can see that the person before them is mentally ill and that imprisonment is an inappropriate placement or setting for that person. But because the mandatory sentencing laws tie the judge's hands, the judge has no choice but to send somebody to prison, even though they're mentally ill. And so we focused on the problem of mentally ill people who were confined in punitive segregation, because what we found, punitive segregation is where people are put, where prisoners are put who violate some prison rules or get into trouble inside prison. And we found a disproportionate...
Called segregated housing unit.
Segregated housing unit.
SHU.
Right, SHU, exactly. Euphemism for the fact that it's really punitive segregation and isolation.
It's 23 hours.
23 hours to 24 hours a day.
In a small cell.
A small cell for sometimes weeks, months, or years at a time. And the worst thing we see when we go into a state prison, because we, as you indicated at the beginning, we make appointments so they know we're coming, they clean up the place, but we go into a punitive segregation unit and see a mentally ill person who's in a state of breakdown. That's a terrible thing, and it's we call it a form of state-inflicted brutality. Because there are thousands of mentally ill people locked up in that kind of situation in New York State prisons. We, along with a number of other organizations and some very helpful state legislators, promoted a bill that was eventually signed into law in January by Spitzer, which will severely restrict the housing of mentally ill people in punitive segregation units, and will call for the creation of alternative treatment units that will provide humane treatment for mentally ill people in prison. So
correction officers have no training, do they?
They have some training, but usually insufficient training. And this was a piece of legislation where the correction officers, and we don't often have the correction officers union as an ally. And this piece of legislation, the correction officers joined with us in calling for it because their members, their correction officers, have enormous problems with mentally ill people that are confined in punitive segregation units. And there's a much better way to handle people in that situation, and we're going to monitor how the state implements the law and see, in fact, if they follow through on what the law calls for and they create these more humane treatment units so mentally ill people get responded to properly and humanely.
Well, years ago you ran a campaign against prison construction.
Yes.
Now that we have so many people incarcerated, are all those prisons filled?
No. As a matter of fact, it's a good question, because the New York State is one of the few states where the prison population has actually declined in recent years. Even though it's much greater than it was in 1973 when the drug laws were passed, peaked in 1999 at over 71,000. It is now at about 62,500. So there's been a reduction in the state prison population of about 9,000 people. But no prisons have been closed.
It's so fast. That's what's so fascinating,
Right.
the political connection.
Exactly. Yeah.
Tell
So,
us.
so there's some prisons are clearly underutilized.
Yeah.
And in fact, in Spitzer's proposed budget, which he put on the table to the legislature in January, it called for the defunding of 4 state prisons. But the Republicans in the state Senate came back. By this time, Patterson was in the governor's seat, and basically said to Patterson, "We want to keep those prisons open because they provide jobs and revenue for
They're the backbone
districts."
of some of these communities, right?
Right.
So,
And our objection, and what we try to communicate unsuccessfully to Governor Patterson, is that it's one thing when you have a jobs program that provides for a valuable service or a needed product. This is a jobs program that's based on the warehousing of human beings. And Patterson should particularly be concerned about that, because the human beings are people from the kind of community he used to represent, because he was a state senator from Harlem.
Right.
The vast majority of people locked up in these upstate white rural communities are people of color from New York City.
New York City, so that if you've got women mothers, so they're up in Albion,
Right.
And, you know,
It creates more
or
problems,
you get
more
families
difficulty.
that travel overnight to get
and,
up there.
And it contributes to the disintegration of families and communities. And
So again, if we had more community-based,
exactly. If we repealed the mandatory sentencing laws, had more community-based programs so there could be more diversion, we would continue to reduce the state prison population and put pressure on the powers that be, the legislators and the governor.
and
to
then
close prisons.
add to that also community-based programs for the people coming out.
Exactly.
And then we've cleared up the whole problem. And it's good because we've come to the end of this program.
On that note, great.
Right.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Bob.
Okay.
It was really very interesting.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to
It's
be here.
very
Thank you.
sad, too.
Yeah.
It makes me so unhappy every time we discuss it.
We keep fighting.
Yeah. Thank
Good.
you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.